My life with Robert was a perfect facade of wealth and ambition, built on his success as a high-powered consultant. But the truth began to unravel the night I saw him across a crowded restaurant, sending me a loving text while he was clearly planning my financial ruin with his mistress, Elara Vance. The shock didn't break me. It sharpened me. I refused to scream, cry, or file for a messy divorce that would only benefit him. Instead, I chose the long game, the silent shadow. I meticulously gathered evidence, using my knowledge of his routine and financial secrets to build a devastating case. I placed a GPS tracker on his car, accessed his offshore accounts, and secretly retrieved damning documents from his safety deposit box, all while maintaining the comforting facade of the devoted wife. The goal wasn't just divorce. It was solvency and justice. I manufactured a corporate crisis, isolating Robert from his powerful partner and his vengeful mistress. I forced him to empty his escape fund into a joint account, only to seize it in a final, swift legal maneuver. The quiet confrontation ended with Robert utterly ruined, his career destroyed by the consequences I had orchestrated. The final, powerful irony? I now thrive as the chief strategy officer of the reformed firm in his old house with the diamond-studded Mont Blanc pen, the symbol of his final defeat, watching over my work. I learned that the greatest power is not loud. It is the silent, strategic competence that turns a lifetime of being underestimated into the ultimate, quiet victory. I didn't just survive his betrayal. I used it to build my empire. The silence was always the most dangerous part of my life. Not the absence of sound, but the silence I allowed in. The silence that masked the gears turning underneath. I thought I had built a life on solid ground here in Texas, a life of predictable elegance, of quiet success, and, most importantly, a life with Robert. Robert. The name used to feel like an anchor. Now? It feels like the sound of a ship breaking apart on the rocks. I was at the Onyx Room that night. A place reserved for quiet deals and whispered fortunes. I had arrived early, a habit of mine, a need to survey the landscape before I entered the game. The table was tucked away, a perfect vantage point. I was nursing a glass of a sharp, cold Chardonnay, the kind that forces you to focus. I remember the feel of the velvet seat, the precise angle of the silverware. I remember everything, because in this life, in my life, every detail is a weapon waiting to be aimed. I was expecting a Mr. Hawthorne, a man who believed precision in textiles mirrored precision in life. I checked my phone, setting it face up beside my glass. It was 7:15 p.m. Robert had called at 6, his voice thick with a sort of weary charm. Bad news, my love. Mom is insisting on one of her infamous Southern comfort dinners. Pot roast and forced conversation. I won't be back until late. Hate to miss you. I remember smiling, thinking, poor Robert, trapped by his mother's suffocating love. It was a comfortable scene to imagine. Safe. Familiar. Then I looked up. It wasn't Mr. Hawthorne. It was Robert. He was 3 tables away. He wasn't wearing his mom's dinner sweater. He was in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, the one I had insisted he buy in New York. His hand rested lightly on the small of a woman's back as the maitre d' seated them. A woman whose blonde hair was not quite the color of Texas sunlight, more manufactured, more intentional. My first thought wasn't betrayal. It was impossibility. A cold calculation. Robert was 300 miles away, stuck in a family obligation. The logic center of my brain was screaming, error, error, contradiction. I watched them. The way he pulled out her chair, the way he leaned in, a conspiratorial, intimate gesture I hadn't seen directed at me in months. He had told me his mother's dinner was mandatory, yet here he was, performing mandatory intimacy for someone else. I felt a strange, chilling sense of detachment. I was Clara, the professional, the observer. And across that short expanse of polished wood and candlelight, Robert was a character in a play I hadn't been cast in. I could have stood up. I could have screamed. I could have thrown that cold glass of Chardonnay. But I didn't. Why? Because the professional in me knew that a scene provides information. And information is power. I was not going to give away my power for a moment of messy, emotional truth. I just stared, a silent statue carved from ice and disbelief. I needed proof that wasn't just visual. I needed evidence that would hurt. It was then that my phone vibrated. The screen lit up, a single text notification from Robert. Stuck at mom's for dinner, love you. I read it twice. The lie, pristine and immediate, delivered straight into the chasm between us. It was an act of audacious, casual cruelty that transcended simple infidelity. It was a complete dismissal of my intelligence, a mockery of our commitment. He sent the text as he was looking into the eyes of another woman, smiling, raising a glass to her. The audacity, the sheer, cold-blooded nerve of it. The lie was not a cover, it was a performance, and I was the audience. My hand was shaking, not with rage, but with the effort of holding still. The ice in my drink had stopped rattling. The jazz felt louder now, mocking. I looked around. No one noticed me. My table was in shadow, his table was in the light. The irony was suffocating. He was 3 tables away, but in that moment he felt a universe away. The woman, whose name I didn't yet know, laughed, a high, tinkling sound that scraped against my composure. They were celebrating something. I knew it. But what? The death of my marriage? The beginning of their cheap affair? No. It was deeper than that. Robert was too careful for a quick fling. This was calculated. This was an investment. This was betrayal with a business plan. You see the silence? The paralysis? That's the feeling of a world crumbling without a sound. Imagine letting this information fade into the noise of the internet. If you feel even a sliver of that cold knot of betrayal, don't let this story become another fleeting moment. Press that subscribe button. Don't be a silent witness to my story's end. Be a part of my journey to power. If you refuse to subscribe, I want you to go into the comments, right now, and tell me why you're comfortable letting the world's most intimate betrayals remain unwatched. Tell me your fear. Mr. Hawthorne arrived at 7:45. He was, as expected, wearing a tie that cost more than my first car. He launched into a lengthy, meticulous description of Peruvian cotton blends. I listened, I nodded. I responded with exactly the right questions. I was present physically. But my mind, my real self, was 3 tables away, meticulously cataloging the enemy. The woman, early 30s, judging by the smooth, unburdened skin. Expensive, understated jewelry. She wasn't flashy. That was the first clue. Robert hated flashy. She had an air of competence, a self-possession that spoke not of an affair but of a partnership. They weren't whispering sweet nothings, they were discussing spreadsheets. I caught the tail end of a phrase, the Q3 projections. And another, the Delaware LLC. This wasn't a romance. It was a merger. Robert had been distant for months. I had attributed it to the pressure of his work, the stress of running his consulting firm. I had comforted him, built him up, managed our home, handled the social calendar, providing the perfect, serene foundation for his ambition. I had been the silent, supportive partner. And this was my reward, to be the silent witness to my replacement. The heartbreak didn't arrive as a scream, or a torrent of tears. It arrived like a diagnosis, cold, clinical, irreversible. It wasn't the image of them touching that broke me. It was the realization that the last 5 years of my life, the trust, the intimacy, the shared dreams were built on a foundation as solid as a Texas mirage. He hadn't just cheated on me, he had architected a lie, a parallel reality, while I was busy living in the one we supposedly shared. I finished my meeting with Mr. Hawthorne. I even managed a sincere smile as I shook his hand. I am good at my job. I am good at presenting a flawless exterior. That night, that skill saved me. It was the only armor I had left. As I walked past their table on the way out, I made a small, calculated move, a fleeting moment of control. I dropped my napkin. It fluttered to the floor near the man's chair. I bent to retrieve it, my hair shielding my face. For 3 agonizing seconds, I was inches from them. I heard the woman's voice, clear and crisp. And your mother will never need to know about the Aspen property. It's cleaner that way. And Robert's low, familiar reply. Of course. My wife and my mother are the 2 people who must never suspect a thing. He said it with such casual confidence, such utter lack of remorse. The 2 people who must never suspect. He had categorized me with his own mother a benign, easily managed obstacle. That was the deepest wound. Not the infidelity but the absolute, arrogant confidence in my stupidity. I stood up, gripping the napkin. I didn't look at them. But as I passed the maitre d's stand, I made another move, Quietly, I handed him a folded $50 bill, a small price for a large piece of information. My contact, I murmured. The man who just left the table by the window. Did he leave a name for his reservation? He's a friend of my husband's. The maitre d' glanced at the bill, then at the table. He nodded once, discreetly, and spoke the name into the hush of the room. It wasn't Robert, it was Mr. Smith. A common name, a shield. But the woman, her name, he confirmed, was Alara Vance. Alara Vance. The name felt like a stone in my hand. I walked out into the cold Texas night, not heartbroken, not yet. I was something much, much colder. I was a strategist with a target, and now I had a name. I drove home, but I didn't go inside. I parked a block away, in the quiet shade of a live oak tree. I sat there, watching the windows of the home Robert and I had built, a monument to a lie. I pulled out my phone. I didn't call him. I didn't text him. I opened my banking app. I checked the joint account. Then the separate trust account. And finally, the account I had opened, years ago, on the advice of my shrewd Texan grandmother, the in case of emergency fund. I saw the numbers, the foundation of our shared life. But now, they felt like the battle lines of an impending war. I knew, in that cold, paralyzing moment, that I had to secure my defenses before I launched the first attack. Robert didn't just have a lover. He had a co-conspirator, and I was about to become the silent observer of their downfall. I returned to the house just before midnight, 2 hours before Robert was scheduled to roll in, smelling faintly of his mother's pot roast and a very convincing alibi. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching nothing, disturbing nothing. The house was perfect. Too perfect. It had been my cage, one I had helped gold plate. The tears finally came, not in a great wash of sadness, but as two solitary drops, cold as mercury, that tracked paths down my cheeks. They weren't for the loss of Robert, they were for the loss of the belief in Robert. The waste of my own careful, loyal devotion. I allowed myself 10 minutes. 10 minutes to mourn the dead thing that was my marriage. Then, the tears dried, and the cold calculation began. Vengeance. I quickly decided, would not be loud, it would not be messy, it would not be driven by emotion. That was what he expected. That was the crazy wife narrative he was prepared to manage. No. My vengeance would be subtle, systemic, and utterly devastating. It would be a game of timing, of quiet leverage, of perfectly placed dominoes. I started with the digital realm, the modern battlefield. Robert was a creature of habit, especially digital habit. The consulting firm meant he was constantly managing documents, assets, and communications. I knew his personal passwords. Not because I spied, but because I was his wife, the one who reset his accounts when he forgot, the one who handled the logistics. I began my digital reconnaissance. I created a clean laptop, untraceable, a ghost machine. Using a VPN and incognito windows, I dove into the depths of Robert's life. The first discovery confirmed my fear. Alara Vance was not merely a girlfriend. She was the chief operations officer of a competitor firm, a firm that had recently been aggressively courting Robert's top clients. The merger I had suspected was a professional one, interwoven with the personal. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was corporate espionage wrapped in infidelity. He wasn't risking his marriage for love, he was risking it for greed, and a particularly nasty brand of ambition. The Q3 projections, the Delaware LLC, the Aspen property, it all clicked into place. They weren't just planning a life together. They were planning a corporate coup, using his insider knowledge to steal my clients, steal his partner's trust, and steal our joint assets to fund their new venture. The stakes were higher than the divorce court. They were in the realm of financial fraud. By 1 a.m., I had done 3 things. First, I changed the passwords on all our shared investment accounts, the ones where I was the primary authorized user. I left the money where it was, but locked him out completely. He wouldn't notice until the next quarterly statement, giving me 3 months of quiet control. Second, I created a sophisticated, automated script to silently mirror and archive his incoming and outgoing work emails. The man loved his custom folders, never deleting a thing. I needed a complete, unassailable record. Third, and most crucially, I quietly executed the transfer of the funds from the in case of emergency account into an offshore account in my name, established years ago by my grandmother's legal team in the Caymans. It was not illegal. It was just shielded. Our home equity, my inheritance, my personal savings, it was all now beyond his immediate reach. The lion had been declawed before the fight even began. The garage door whirred open. Robert's car. He walked in, his gait tired, his tie slightly askew. The scent of an expensive Italian restaurant, not pot roast, clung faintly to his charcoal suit. He found me sitting on the edge of the bed, reading a financial report, a perfect, innocuous image of the dedicated wife. He smiled, a tired, practiced, affectionate smile. He came over, kissed my forehead, a light, non-committal touch. "Long night, my love," he murmured, his eyes already closing as he peeled off his jacket. Mom was absolutely impossible. I looked up at him, my face a mask of wifely concern. I didn't say a word. I just nodded, and in that silent nod, I sealed his fate. He had no idea that the dinner at his mom's had already been catalogued, documented, and would soon become the first line in the indictment against him. He was tired. I was awake. And I was already playing a game he didn't even know had started. Anger is a blunt instrument. It burns the holder more than the target. I understood this. The fire that had ignited in me was not the wild, destructive kind. It was the controlled, intense heat of a smelter. It was focused on purification. My goal was not simply to hurt Robert. My goal was to reclaim my life. And to do that, I needed to understand the mechanics of the deception he had built around me. I needed to move from the heartbroken wife to the meticulous operative. I needed to become the silent shadow. My first act as the shadow was to establish a perimeter. Robert, like most men of his type, was supremely confident in his domestic blindness. He believed the house was safe, a sanctuary where his secrets could never be discovered because his wife was too busy managing the schedule and the social obligations. He never considered that the manager of the home is the keeper of all its vulnerabilities. I started small, focusing on his car. It was a black Mercedes, sleek and unassuming, a perfect canvas for deception. Within the space of one afternoon, while he was at a client meeting, with Alara Vance, I executed the first phase of my physical surveillance. Using a small, high-sensitivity GPS tracker I purchased through a burner account and delivered to a P.O. box. I affixed it magnetically to the interior of the rear bumper, right above the exhaust pipe. It was hidden, secure, and gave me real-time, minute-by-minute location data. The GPS feed was a revelation. It confirmed my initial suspicion instantly. Robert's daily route was a ballet of lies. The trips to the gym were 45 minutes at Alara's luxury apartment complex. The late nights at the office were spent in a discreet, unmarked industrial park office that I quickly cross-referenced to the Delaware LLC documents I had archived. Every location was a fresh piece of evidence, yet none of it was needed for confrontation. It was needed for leverage. I realized my true power lay not in the knowing, but in the silence of the knowing. Robert moved through his days with the ease of a man completely unobserved. He was a performance artist on a brightly lit stage. I was the lone critic in the dark back row, holding the contract that detailed his eventual failure. The hardest thing was maintaining the facade. I had to live in the intimacy of the lie. I had to continue making his morning coffee, listening to his fabricated stories of work stress, and offering the comforting, supportive wife responses he expected. One evening, he came home late, exhausted. He leaned his head on my shoulder while we watched the news. I smelled Alara's expensive, citrus-based perfume, faint, but unmistakable on his collar. My instinct was to recoil, to push him away. Instead, I tightened my embrace. I stroked his hair. I said, "You work too hard, darling. You need a break." And I felt the small, terrifying thrill of being perfectly, coldly in control. He trusted me completely. It was his greatest vulnerability. The deeper his trust, the more devastating my eventual strike would be. My investigation quickly moved from the physical to the psychological. I began studying Robert's routine like a pattern of clockwork. He had a tendency to discard documents in a precise, almost arrogant way straight into the secure shredder in his home office. This meant his waste paper basket was always empty, presenting a challenge. But Robert, the man obsessed with outward perfection, had a flaw: his desk. He had a hidden, shallow drawer beneath the main desktop where he kept things he needed on hand but out of sight. Things like spare keys, receipts he hadn't categorized yet, and, Most importantly, his small, specialized USB drive containing his encryption keys for sensitive external communications. He thought the drawer was a secret. I knew about it because I had designed the desk for him 5 years earlier. I waited 2 full days for the right window. Thursday morning, he had an early flight to Austin, a guaranteed 8 hours of absence. I dressed in casual clothes, put on gloves, and entered his office. The gloves were not for fingerprints. I needed no protection from him. They were for focus. They were a ritual, turning Clara the wife into Clara the operative. Accessing the drawer was trivial. Inside, alongside the key to the Mercedes, was a smaller, tarnished silver key. I picked it up. It wasn't a house key, or a storage unit key. It was a safety deposit box key. This was the first true piece of gold I had found outside the digital sphere. Robert had never mentioned a private box. This was where the physical evidence, the contracts, the original schematics, the truly dangerous documents were hidden. I quickly photographed the key's markings and returned it precisely as I found it. I didn't take the USB drive yet. That was too aggressive. I was still gathering intelligence. I needed the full map before I launched the invasion. Later that day, the GPS tracker led Robert to a small, private aviation hangar outside of Houston. He was gone for 4 hours. When he returned, the tracker showed a detour to a high-end jeweler before he finally came home. That night, I pretended to be asleep when he came to bed. He moved slowly, deliberately. I listened to the sounds of him undressing. Then, a small, distinct clink, the sound of metal against glass as he placed something on his bedside table. In the faint moonlight, I saw a small, black velvet box. Inside, glittering, was a delicate diamond bracelet. For me? I wondered, a momentary flicker of the old hope, the old naivete. I held my breath, waiting for the apology, the gift of reconciliation. Robert stared at the box for a long moment, a conflicted expression on his face. Then, he closed the box and slipped it, not into his own drawer, but into a travel bag he rarely used. It wasn't meant for me. It was for Alara. A bribe, perhaps, or a celebration. He was purchasing affection and loyalty with my money. The bracelet was a physical manifestation of the lie, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that it would become a critical piece of the evidence against him. My internal state was shifting rapidly from initial shock to a cold, clinical certainty. I was shedding the identity of the betrayed woman and embracing the role of the vengeful strategist. The grief was now a tool, sharpening my focus. I spent the next 2 days creating a detailed, multi-layered action plan. I organized it into 3 phases. Phase I, asset containment and intelligence acquisition, already completed the containment. Now focused on using the safety deposit box key. Phase II, antagonist isolation and manipulation, turning Thomas against Robert. Exposing Ilara's professional motives. Phase III, public and legal exposure, the final, fatal move. I needed the contents of that safety deposit box before I could move to Phase II. But first, I needed to know the bank, and the exact location. The answer, as always, was hidden in plain sight. Robert had a terrible memory for numbers. I knew he used the same 3 code phrases for all his financial security questions. He had once shared them with me, drunkenly, laughing about his own predictability. I opened his laptop again, accessing the archived files. I found a scanned document, his annual legal retainer. In the corner, scribbled faintly in his hand, was a 5-digit number and 3 letters, A, B, C. I cross-referenced the code against his known financial institutions. The only nearby bank using a 3-letter, 5-digit access system for its private vaults was a small, exclusive branch downtown, the same bank that handled Mr. Davies's personal investments. Robert wasn't just hiding documents there. He was linking himself directly to the enemy's power structure. The key in the shallow drawer. The code word. The bank. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying ease. He wasn't a mastermind. He was simply arrogant, believing his perfect wife would never look. That night, Robert called me from the office. He sounded rushed, stressed. The internal audit, triggered by the anonymous tips I had sent to Thomas, was clearly causing friction. Listen, Clara, I need you to do me a favor. Nothing big. Can you just check the main safe? Make sure that the Q3 projections for the Davies account are there. Just a quick check. I can't remember if I filed them digitally or if I brought the hard copies home. I need to know by tomorrow. The request was a gift. The main safe was the one place he truly believed was secure. But the combination our wedding anniversary, his favorite sporting number, and the last 4 digits of my old university ID was something I knew by heart. He was directing my attention to the place he wanted me to look, providing a distraction while he handled the real chaos. I agreed, my voice calm, comforting. Of course, Robert. I'll check right now. I hung up, not moving toward the safe. I moved instead to the hall closet, where I kept my own small fireproof box, a box that contained the original notarized documents for my inheritance, already transferred into the Cayman structure. I looked at the contents. I looked at the desk where Robert sat, convinced of his control. I realized this request was my final test. If I simply checked the safe, I was still the wife, the obedient pawn. If I ignored him, he would suspect something. I had to play the role perfectly, and then go after the real prize. The safety deposit box, not the Q3 projections. The silent shadow was ready to make her first true external move. The air in the house felt electrified. The game was escalating. Robert's request, the casual check of the safe, was the starting pistol. He had provided the perfect alibi for my focus on the house. I had reported back, calm and professional. Yes, the Q3 projections are exactly where you left them, darling. Filed and secure. The lie was swallowed whole. He believed he was controlling the narrative, sending me on a benign errand while he panicked about the audit. He had given me a window of assumed obedience. I used it to leave the house. The silver key was still safely hidden in his drawer. I couldn't risk taking it yet, but I didn't need the key to find the box. I only needed the bank name and the code. I drove downtown, parking several blocks away from the elegant, limestone building of First Texas Trust. I walked the rest of the way, adopting the anonymity of a busy professional woman on a quick errand. I was dressed in a tailored suit, expensive but forgettable. My goal was simple: confirm the existence of the box linked to the code. I approached the discreet, heavy brass desk. I asked the clerk for the manager. When the manager arrived, I presented a scenario I had meticulously crafted. My husband, Mr. Robert Harris, has instructed me to confirm the details of his private vault access. He is traveling and is paranoid about security breaches at his firm. I need to confirm the 3-letter prefix ABC and the number. I presented my ID, my married name, Robert's wife. I presented the official paperwork linking me to his primary bank accounts. The manager, accustomed to high net worth paranoia, looked sympathetic. He performed a quick, discreet search. Yes, Mrs. Harris, he confirmed quietly. The box is active. Vault code ABCXXXXX. Would you like to check the security logs? I declined, feigning relief. No, thank you. Just the confirmation is enough. He'll rest easier. I walked out, the knowledge settling in my gut like a lead weight. The box was real. The access was linked, however tenuously, to me. And most importantly, Robert had not yet restricted my access, believing I was still oblivious to his secrets. I didn't try to access the box that day. That would leave a paper trail and trigger an immediate alert on Robert's end. Instead, I returned home and spent the evening making an inventory of what I did have, and what I was willing to sacrifice. I had the digital evidence, the location trackers, the offshore funds, and the knowledge of the safety deposit box. What I lacked was the time to execute the retrieval without risk. I needed to create an external crisis, a diversion that would consume Robert and Alara's focus entirely, forcing them into a high-stakes reaction that would leave them exposed. I needed to test the waters of their deception and see how far they would swim into the panic. The anonymous tips I had previously sent to Thomas, Robert's business partner, were Phase 0. Now it was time for Phase 1. This move required subtlety and precision, aimed not at Robert directly, but at the professional ecosystem he and Alara were trying to colonize. I focused on the largest client Robert was trying to steal for Alara's new firm, a massive manufacturing conglomerate called Athel Industries. I knew from the archived emails that Athel was hypersensitive about intellectual property and data integrity. I crafted a single, short, anonymous email, sent from a newly established, disposable secure server. I used a carefully chosen pseudonym, a concerned competitor, and sent it directly to Ethel's chief legal officer. The email was not an accusation. It was a single, highly technical question, phrased to sound like a professional warning. Are you aware of the emerging conflict of interest risk stemming from Harris Consulting's use of the Titan Protocol data standards in its ongoing engagement with a direct competitor's proposed Q3 strategy? The IP overlap potential is significant and warrants an internal review. The brilliance of the message was its vagueness. It contained no proof, no names, just the chilling suggestion of a massive IP conflict and the use of the term Titan Protocol, a proprietary piece of software Robert's firm relied on. It didn't accuse Robert or Alara. It simply questioned the structural integrity of the firms involved. The effect was instantaneous. Athol Industries was known for its knee-jerk, defensive, corporate culture. The next day, the GPS tracker showed Robert's Mercedes locked in a frantic, 2-hour loop between his office, Alara's firm headquarters, and a high-end corporate law office. The internal audit, which was manageable, had suddenly escalated into a crisis involving their largest client and a legal threat. I watched him on the surveillance feed I had planted in his study, focused only on the desk area, where he left sensitive documents. I saw him pacing, rubbing his temples, yelling into the phone. The cool, arrogant confidence was cracking. The surveillance feed caught a crucial moment. Robert and Alara were on a video call. I could hear Alara's voice, sharp and icy, echoing from his speaker. "This is too sophisticated, Robert. This isn't Thomas. This is someone who knows the Titan Protocol and knows Ethel's vulnerability. We need a distraction, we need a fall guy. Find someone expendable. Someone who had access to the data stream last month. We pin the data leak on them now before Ethel pulls out completely." Robert nodded grimly. His eyes landed on a photograph on his desk, a smiling, unsuspecting junior analyst named Michael who had just been hired 6 months ago. The speed and casual cruelty with which they decided to ruin an innocent life for their own protection was sickening. It confirmed that their capacity for betrayal extended far beyond just me. I had tested the waters. They were cold, deep, and polluted by ruthless ambition. They were willing to sacrifice anyone, including each other, if it meant saving the core of their scheme. The internal crisis I manufactured served a double purpose. Not only did it expose their willingness to scapegoat, but it also forced Robert to urgently seek access to his deepest secrets. To the documents he thought would save him, the contents of the safety deposit box. The GPS tracker was gold. It showed me that Robert began making late-night, solitary trips to the First Texas Trust. He wasn't there to conduct business, he was there to check, organize, or perhaps move the documents. The panic I had created was forcing him into the open. I needed to strike while they were distracted by the Ethel fire. I needed to get into that box. The solution presented itself in the form of a minor health crisis. Robert was chronically late for appointments. I knew his dentist had been trying to schedule a much-needed root canal for weeks. I called the dental office. I used a voice modulator app on my burner phone and, adopting the voice of a harassed legal assistant, informed the dentist that due to a critical and urgent legal deposition, Mr. Robert Harris had to reschedule his root canal for tomorrow at 9 a.m., insisting on immediate confirmation of the appointment. The dental office, eager to fill the unexpected opening, agreed instantly. I immediately logged into Robert's calendar via the archived email server and deleted the original appointment, replacing it with the new one. I sent a simple text from my personal phone. "Dentist confirmed for 9 a.m. tomorrow. Don't be late. Love you." He barely glanced at the notification. I had secured a 2-hour window, a guaranteed absence from the office and the house, timed perfectly during the morning rush when his guard would be lowest. I couldn't take the silver key, but I could copy it. I spent the remainder of the evening at an obscure, all-night locksmith shop 20 miles from our home. I presented the photograph of the silver key I had taken days before, claiming I had lost the original and needed a copy made from the picture, a difficult, expensive request that the desperate locksmith agreed to perform for a premium fee. I paid in cash, ensuring no digital trace. By 3 a.m., I held the duplicate silver key in my hand. It was cold, metallic, and felt disproportionately heavy with the weight of the secrets it held. I sat in my darkened kitchen, reviewing my plan. My mission was 9 a.m. Robert would be strapped into the dental chair, incapacitated, focused only on the drill. Alara would be consumed by the Athol crisis. Thomas was nervously running the audit. The world was aligned for the shadow to act. I took the forged key and placed it on the counter, next to the small, elegant diamond bracelet Robert had purchased for Elora and hidden in his travel bag. I opened the velvet box. The diamond glittered under the kitchen lights. A symbol of reckless deceit. I made a choice. I didn't take the bracelet. Not yet. I had a deeper, more refined irony in mind for that piece of jewelry. Instead, I took Robert's favorite, expensive pen, a heavy Mont Blanc he rarely let out of his sight. I slipped it into my suit pocket, next to the forged key. He would only notice it was missing hours after the box had been compromised. I was ready to cross the boundary. The next morning, I wouldn't be Clara, the wife. I would be a ghost, gaining unauthorized access to my own financial destruction, armed with a fake key and a very expensive Mont Blanc. The silence of the night was the last moment of peace before the retrieval of the final, physical evidence that would lead to Robert's absolute undoing. The morning felt like the prelude to a bank heist in a Hollywood film, only my adrenaline was ice, not fire. Robert left exactly at 8:40 a.m. for his forced 9 a.m. root canal. I watched the Mercedes disappear on the GPS tracker. His path was direct and predictable. He was completely distracted, focused on the pain that awaited him. I waited 5 minutes, ensuring he was truly gone and had no reason to return for a forgotten item. Then, I drove downtown, taking a circuitous route to avoid the main thoroughfare he used. I parked 2 blocks from the First Texas Trust, this time in a professional parking garage, paid for in cash from a prepaid debit card. I wasn't just observing. I was moving on the offensive. I walked into the bank at 9:15 a.m. The lobby was quiet, the usual Tuesday morning lull. I approached the vault desk with the confidence of someone entitled to be there. I presented my ID, and the manager I had spoken to days earlier recognized me with a polite nod. "Good morning. My husband, Mr. Harris, asked me to retrieve a document for his urgent 10:30 a.m. meeting. It's an original, and he wanted me to handle it personally. Vault ABC XXXXX. I signed the access log with a signature that mirrored Robert's, a skill learned through years of signing checks and holiday cards on his behalf. I used the forged silver key. It clicked into the lock flawlessly. The manager turned the master key. I was led into the private viewing room, a small, soundproof chamber with a heavy, polished wood table. The manager placed the safety deposit box, a heavy, dark metal container, on the table and left, closing the door softly behind him. I was finally alone with the heart of Robert's deception. I opened the box. It wasn't filled with cash or jewels. It was filled with paper. Contracts, letters and documents, meticulously organized with Robert's neat, arrogant handwriting. This wasn't a criminal hideout. It was an archive of betrayal. The contents confirmed everything. The Delaware LLC incorporation papers, explicitly naming Robert Harris and Alara Vance as joint signatories and principal owners of the competitor firm, effectively proving corporate espionage and theft of opportunity. Original deed to the Aspen property, purchased 6 months ago, using funds secretly diverted from our joint equity line. Registered entirely in Alara's name, but with Robert as the sole guarantor, a massive financial risk for him and a clear sign of his total commitment to her. Encrypted flash drive, labeled simply Q4 Future. This was the real prize, the detailed planning documents, the list of proprietary client data they intended to steal, and the final schematics for bankrupting the old firm. I didn't panic. I worked fast, methodically. I used the small, specialized, silent camera I had brought to photograph every single document front and back, every signature, every stamp. I then used a military-grade data duplicator to clone the entire contents of the encrypted flash drive onto 2 separate, clean drives, one for immediate use, one for permanent archival in the Cayman structure. Before leaving, I performed the final, surgical act of Phase I. I found a crucial, signed letter of intent, a document Robert and Alara had drawn up detailing their plan to divide the old firm's assets. I took the Mont Blanc pen from my pocket, Robert's prized possession, and used it to sign my initials, Clara Harris, in tiny, almost invisible script, right on the non-critical back margin of the document. A subtle, signature move. A cold, quiet declaration. I was here. I replaced the Mont Blanc in my pocket. I left the duplicated evidence in the box, precisely as I found it. The bank had the records of my access. The box contained the forged evidence. Robert would be compromised, even if he realized the documents had been photographed. I had set a perfect trap. I returned home at 10:45 a.m. 30 minutes before Robert was due to arrive. The house was quiet. The operation had been executed flawlessly. The physical evidence was secured. I spent the next hour processing the digital intelligence from the Q4 future drive. It was worse than I thought. Not only were they stealing clients, but they were planning to engage in a fraudulent tax shelter scheme via the Delaware LLC, an action that carried serious federal penalties. This wasn't just about a divorce settlement anymore. This was about criminal liability. The most damning revelation, however, concerned Michael, the young analyst they had chosen as the scapegoat for the Athol IP leak. The files showed that Michael had actually uncovered the initial discrepancy in Robert's books a month ago and had quietly reported it to Robert, believing it was an honest mistake. Robert had then used that information to accelerate his exit, and now, he was planning to ruin Michael to protect himself. This was the emotional turning point. Robert was not just a cheating husband. He was a moral vacuum, actively destroying innocent people to shield his greed. My vengeance ceased to be about me and became about justice. Michael had to be saved. I knew that executing the plan to save Michael would mean revealing a fraction of my hand. I had to interfere directly with Robert's current, live operation. It was a risk, but necessary. Robert was due home any minute. I worked with the speed and intensity of a machine. I used the clone data from the Q4 future drive to create a highly detailed, one-page report. This report outlined the exact complex data manipulation Robert and Alara had used to frame Michael, including server IP addresses and timestamps only they had access to. I sent the report not to Thomas, not to the police, but to Michael himself, via an untraceable, encrypted communication channel, labeling it simply, proof. Use this to save yourself. Do not reply. Do not speak. Robert's Mercedes pulled into the driveway at 11:15 a.m. I was standing by the window, my laptop closed, my face calm. The silence was perfect. Robert walked in, looking pale and miserable. The pain medication hadn't kicked in yet. He was sweating, and his usual air of tailored perfection was gone. He was a mess. A weak man, exposed. He barely looked at me. He stumbled into his office, went straight to his desk, and his hand instinctively went to the shallow drawer beneath the desktop. He needed his pen, his key, or the illusion of security. I watched him on the discreet camera feed on my phone. He noticed the Mont Blanc was missing almost instantly. He searched the desk, his panic rising. He opened the shallow drawer again, searching more frantically. The missing pen was a crack in his control. He ran his hand through his hair, pacing. He didn't check the safe. He didn't check the Q3 projections. He checked his security. He called the bank manager instantly, his voice low and hostile. He didn't ask about the documents, he asked about the access log. I heard his voice echo faintly from the living room. Someone accessed Vault ABC XXXXX this morning? Who? My wife? Yes, Mrs. Harris. Did she say why? Did she take anything? He hung up, his face a mask of dawning, terrifying realization. He looked from the office door to the bedroom, the direction where I stood, waiting. He didn't yet know what I knew. But he knew I had breached his final, most secret perimeter. The silence was over. The game was now in the open, but only for him. He was trapped by the evidence he himself had put there. He had walked straight into my silent ambush. His arrogance was about to cost him everything. Robert's eyes, when he finally walked out of his office, were not filled with rage but with a paralyzing, analytical fear. He looked at me, sitting calmly in the living room, reading a book, a perfectly domestic scene, and he was seeing a ghost. A highly competent, highly dangerous ghost. He didn't mention the bank. He didn't mention the missing Mont Blanc. He tried the last card a coward plays, controlled confusion. Clara, honey. I'm feeling dreadful. The anesthetic is making me foggy. I just had a confusing call with the bank. Did you stop by the trust this morning? They seemed worried about a security log error. I met his gaze, my expression warm, concerned, utterly innocent. Oh, darling, yes, I'm sorry. I didn't want to bother you while you were at the dentist. You asked me to check on the Q3 reports, remember? I thought you meant the original signed copies, so I checked the box just to be certain. They were fine. All secure. I just signed the log. Did I do something wrong? The lie was simple. Easy to swallow because it was cloaked in wifely helpfulness. I had given him a perfect alibi for my presence. I had also created a massive blind spot. He would now assume my interest in the box was merely due diligence about the Q3 reports, not a full-scale forensic audit of his life. He bought it. He had to. The alternative that his wife was actively building a case against him was too monstrous for his ego to accept. He relaxed visibly, though the tension still hummed around him. No, that's fine. Thank you, my love. Just the bank being overzealous. He kissed my cheek a dry, distant brush and retreated to the sanctuary of the shower, needing to wash off the fear and the scent of the dentist. I immediately went to the laptop and loaded the documents I had retrieved, focusing specifically on the flash drive contents. Q4 Future. The Q4 file was a treasure trove of financial forecasts and communications detailing the launch of the new rival firm. But buried deep within the spreadsheets, I found a series of transactions marked with a single, cryptic identifier. THM. These weren't payments to vendors or consultants. They were massive, periodic transfers of capital from Robert and Ilara's nascent firm into a series of obscure, offshore holding companies that appeared to have no legitimate business function. And every single transfer was linked to Thomas. This was the secondary betrayal. Robert and Ilara weren't just plotting against their old firm. They were actively siphoning off the startup capital from the rival company they were launching, effectively ensuring that even if their new venture failed, they would still emerge wealthy. They were betraying their future investors, betraying their own plans and, most critically, they were setting up Thomas, the business partner, to take the fall for all the internal audits, the IP leaks and the eventual collapse. They were using Thomas's trust and access as a primary shield. The revelation solidified my resolve. Robert was playing a triple cross. He was cheating on me, cross 1, stealing from his firm cross 2, and actively planning to defraud and ruin his future venture and Thomas cross 3. My initial plan, phase 2, had been to use Thomas as an unwitting pawn. Now, my goal shifted. I had to actively save Thomas from this elaborate, cruel financial execution. Saving him wasn't an act of kindness, it was a matter of strategic leverage. An innocent, grateful, and well-connected business partner was a far more powerful ally than an anonymous ghost. But how could I reach him without revealing the extent of my own surveillance? The moment I helped Thomas, Robert would know I had accessed the Q4 files. The risk was monumental. I spent the afternoon observing Robert. He was on the phone almost constantly, but his conversations were guarded, paranoid. He was clearly trying to figure out if the bank security error was just a flaw in the system, or if I truly knew something. The absence of the Mont Blanc was quietly eating at him, an unfixable itch. I decided my communication with Thomas had to be oblique, deniable, and professional. It couldn't look like a wife's hysterical warning. It had to look like a competitor's cold calculation. I leveraged the one piece of information I knew Thomas trusted: his own accounting records. Robert and Thomas had been close friends and partners for 15 years. Thomas trusted Robert's financial acumen implicitly. That was his greatest weakness. Using my clean laptop and secure connection, I created a shell email account named Audit Watch. I didn't send Thomas the damning Q4 spreadsheets directly. Instead, I sent him a single carefully chosen email containing a highly technical question about his own firm's financial structure. Subject: cross-referencing. Dear Mr. Thomas, we are conducting due diligence on potential Q3 mergers. We've noted a recurring pattern in the Harris Consulting ledger: a slight but persistent discrepancy in the allocation of internal capital gains, specifically related to the THM allocation. Have you verified that this allocation is properly recorded in the external holding company ledger, as per compliance protocols? It was a question only a senior accountant or an insider would ask. It forced Thomas to check his own external ledgers, the ones he rarely looked at, and cross-reference them with the internal allocations Robert managed. He would find the discrepancy, a crack in the foundation of his trust, and he would not be able to trace the warning back to me. He would assume it was the anonymous internal auditor's work. The minutes after I sent the email were agonizing. I watched the clock, waiting for the first sign of impact. The impact came 2 hours later, not through an email, but through the sound of a loud, furious argument erupting in Robert's office. Thomas had called Robert, not Ilara. His voice was raw, laced with disbelief and betrayal. Robert's defense was immediate and shrill, laced with panic. He was denying everything, blaming the incompetent audit team and trying to convince Thomas that the discrepancy was a simple, correctable error. But Thomas was persistent, echoing the exact terminology I had used: the THM allocation. Robert. It's not a mistake. It's a six-figure outflow to an anonymous account. Who is THM Robert? Who is THM? The argument ended abruptly with a slam of the phone. Robert immediately tried to call Thomas back repeatedly. Thomas wasn't answering. The first crack in the foundation of their conspiracy was audible, and it was glorious. Thomas was no longer a pawn. He was a potential asset, awakened by a ghost. Robert was pacing his office like a trapped animal. He realized the threat was escalating beyond the manageable IP leak. This was now internal financial scrutiny, something he couldn't simply pin on a junior analyst. He went immediately to the safe. He opened it, pulled out the Q3 reports I had confirmed were there, and began frantically comparing them with documents on his computer screen. He was looking for a pattern, a mistake. He couldn't find one, because the mistake wasn't in the Q3 reports. It was in the Q4 future. And I was the only one who had the key to that future. He then pulled out his hidden phone, the secure, encrypted line he used only for Alara. He called her. Alara. Thomas is onto the THM allocation. He's asking questions we can't answer. Who else knows about this? This is beyond the Ethel leak. This is about our internal funds. You need to talk to your father immediately. This could ruin everything before we even launch. Alara's response was cold and immediate, confirming the shift in dynamic I had suspected. I told you to control Thomas. If he compromises my position with my father, I will cut you loose, Robert. Fix this. Pin it on someone. Anyone. I don't care how. Just stop the bleed. He hung up, his face ashen. The primary antagonist, Alara, was abandoning him at the first sign of real trouble. Robert was a means to an end for her, and he was failing. The secondary betrayal, the deep and selfish betrayal of their own partnership, was already starting to crumble. Robert didn't return to the main house. He didn't come out for dinner. He stayed locked in his office, his sanctuary now a prison of his own making. The surveillance feed showed him pouring a massive tumbler of scotch, sitting in the dark, staring at his computer screen. The Mont Blanc pen was still missing. The pain from the root canal had returned. He was physically and psychologically dismantled, forced into a reactive state. My vengeance was working, quiet, surgical, and absolutely devastating. I sat alone in the silent dining room, eating a perfect, light meal I had prepared only for myself. The house was calm. The storm was all inside his head. I was ready to move to phase 2, the isolation and public exposure. I had given Robert a taste of fear, and he was drowning in it. The time to call in the ultimate authority was fast approaching. The argument between Robert and Thomas had done more than crack the foundation. It had driven a wedge of paranoia deep into Robert's already fragile mind. He was no longer focused on Alara or his future. He was focused on survival. He was desperately trying to determine the identity of the silent shadow who knew the THM allocation, a detail only he, Alara, and Thomas should have been privy to. I, meanwhile, was in the final stages of ensuring Thomas's safety and, more importantly, securing his potential as an unknowing ally. I had given Thomas the breadcrumb of the THM allocation. Now, I needed to give him the tools to fully protect himself from the imminent scapegoating. Thomas was set to meet with the internal auditors the next morning. Robert and Alara's plan was simple. Convince Thomas that the THM issue was an accounting error, while simultaneously preparing to leak documents that would frame Thomas for the Athel IP breach. My move was subtle and targeted. I couldn't communicate with Thomas again. That would be too suspicious. I had to communicate with the evidence itself. Using the archived data from Robert's files, I found a seemingly innocuous, shared cloud folder where Thomas kept his personal consulting templates and research notes. I accessed it remotely and, with surgical precision, dropped a single encrypted file into the root directory. The file was disguised as a boilerplate legal document titled, Compliance Protocol Review, 2024 Revisions. The contents of that file were a comprehensive, bulleted list of the exact documents Robert and Alara were planning to use to frame Thomas for the IP theft. It didn't accuse Robert. It simply listed, in meticulous, legalistic language, the documents Thomas should review and verify before his audit meeting to ensure his compliance was beyond reproach. It essentially coached him on his defense, forcing him to preemptively discover the manipulated documents. I finished the transfer minutes before Robert left the office for the night. I watched the clock, knowing that Thomas, stressed and methodical, would check his files before his critical meeting. The next morning, Robert left early, looking tired and pale. He was going to the office to meet with Alara, undoubtedly to coordinate their story for the auditors. I knew he was going to lay the final groundwork to pin the IP leak on Thomas. At 9:30 a.m., I got my confirmation. Not through Robert, but through the local news. A small, dry article appeared on a reputable finance blog. Harris Consulting audit delays. Michael Harrison, junior analyst, dismissed amidst IP compliance investigation. They had sacrificed the innocent first, exactly as planned. This was their distraction, the smoke they were releasing to cover the larger financial fire. My anger intensified. I had managed to send Michael his proof, but the immediate damage had been done. I silently vowed that Michael would be the first person I would compensate once I secured my victory. The game was no longer just about Robert. It was about ensuring that his casual cruelty had irreversible consequences. The climax of the day was the Thomas auditor meeting. I couldn't be there, but I could watch Robert's reaction. The GPS showed Robert and Alara waiting nervously at Alara's headquarters, checking their phones every minute. They were waiting for the auditor to call and confirm that Thomas, flustered and unprepared, had signed off on the documents implicating himself. But the call never came. What came instead was an urgent panicked text message from Thomas to Robert, quickly deleted but captured by my archived server. "We need to talk now. The auditors found major inconsistencies in the Ethel contracts, inconsistencies that you handled. They are postponing any further interviews until they get a full statement from legal counsel." What the hell is going on, Robert? My move had worked. Thomas, armed with my anonymous checklist, hadn't fallen for the trap. Instead, he had turned the focus back onto the source of the documents. Robert. The auditors, cautious about the IP scandal, had immediately elevated the investigation to a legal matter, freezing all internal cooperation. Robert and Alara's plan had not just failed, it had spectacularly backfired, causing the investigation to halt and focus directly on Robert's lack of corporate compliance. This was the first major, visible consequence of my quiet manipulation. Robert came home early that afternoon. The dental pain had vanished, replaced by a deep-seated, systemic panic. He walked straight into the house, past me, and poured a heavy drink. He stopped at the living room window, staring out at the manicured Texas lawn, his reflection staring back, a man losing control. He turned slowly to face me. He had a look of cold, calculating suspicion. He had dismissed the bank visit. He couldn't dismiss the Mont Blanc. He couldn't dismiss the THM leak. And now, he couldn't dismiss the auditor's sudden, precise focus on his own contracts. Too many things were going wrong, too precisely, too quietly. He began a subtle, psychological probe, the first real confrontation since the night in the Onyx room. "You know, Clara, I've been thinking about the business. It's getting messy. Very messy. Betrayals everywhere. People you think you trust. I mean, who would ever think Thomas, my partner for 15 years, would try to sabotage us? He was testing me, waiting for me to take the bait, to offer sympathy, to align myself with his narrative of the victimized business owner." I held his gaze, my own eyes cool and empty of emotion. "It's a nasty world, Robert," I replied, my voice measured. "But Thomas has always been meticulous. If he's finding holes, perhaps they were always there." The implication that the holes were Robert's hung heavy in the air. Robert flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible twitch near his eye. He didn't continue the conversation. He knew he was talking to someone who saw too much. The ghost was standing right beside him. Robert retreated again to his office, but this time, he wasn't just working, he was plotting his defense against me. I could see the feverish calculation in his eyes. He realized the leak was internal, intelligent, and deeply personal. He hadn't just lost control of his business, he had lost control of his home. The Mont Blanc, the silent proof of my access, became his obsession. He searched the house again, frantic, desperate to find it, to prove it was a domestic accident, not an intentional signal. I knew the time for subtlety was ending. The fear of me, the suspicion that I knew everything, had to be transformed into proof that I was dangerous. Robert needed to believe I was a threat worth eliminating, both financially and professionally. I had the final damning piece of evidence, the Q4 future plan, the corporate conspiracy, and the Aspen property deed. It was time to introduce a new player, the true puppet master whom Alara was ultimately trying to please. I opened my separate secure phone and accessed my digital archive. I pulled up the initial document I had retrieved from the safety deposit box, the Aspen property deed. I checked the address for the third time, confirming the location of the luxury condo Alara had purchased with their stolen equity. Then, I cross-referenced the property taxes and found a critical detail. The property tax bills were mailed to a corporate office in Miami, the headquarters of Mr. Davies's global holding firm. Alara was not just funding her new life. She was subtly funneling her father's money through this property, leveraging Robert's firm as collateral. I had the full picture now. Infidelity, corporate theft, and familial revenge. The time for whispering warnings was over. The time for calling in the judge, the ultimate judge, was now. Robert's fear was now palpable. It hung in the house like a cold, invisible dust. He knew he was compromised. But his arrogance wouldn't allow him to believe the truth, that I was his operative. He was wasting valuable time trying to hunt down an external enemy, a professional rival, a disgruntled partner, anyone but his own wife. This was the window I needed. I had to escalate the strategy, transforming his generalized fear into a targeted, irresistible panic. My goal in Phase 2 was to achieve two things simultaneously: isolate Robert from Alara and force him to attempt a definitive, large-scale financial transfer that I could intercept. I needed him to believe he still had time to steal and escape. I started with the isolation. Robert relied entirely on Alara's cold competence and her connection to her father, Mr. Davies. I had to sever that link, not by exposing their affair but by attacking Alara's professional reputation within their own sphere of betrayal. I took the damning documents from the Q4 Future Drive, the financial projections for their new firm, and noticed a critical flaw in Alara's signature projections. She had grossly overstated the potential client base in the Austin market, a mistake Robert, being from Texas, should have caught. It was a lapse born of arrogance, not incompetence. I created a new anonymous identity, the Quiet Advisor. I sent a highly encrypted, untraceable message directly to Robert's private work email, the one he thought was secure. Subject: Austin overvaluation. A serious review of the Vance projections shows a 40% exaggeration in the Austin market segmentation. If this flaw is not corrected before Mr. Davies's review next week, the entire valuation is compromised. Trust your own knowledge, not the ambition of others. The message was calibrated to do maximum psychological damage. It flattered Robert's intelligence, trust your own knowledge, while planting a seed of professional doubt about Alara's competence and ambition. It suggested that she was the liability, not him. The reaction was immediate. I heard Robert on the phone with Alara, his voice sharp with accusations, using the exact figures I had cited. The Austin numbers, Alara. They're inflated. How could you miss that? If Davies sees this, the entire Q4 presentation is worthless. You've compromised us with your sloppy work. Alara, arrogant and defensive, fought back, but the professional doubt had been sown. Their alliance, built on shared greed, was fracturing under the pressure of professional scrutiny. Robert spent the next 3 hours in his office, completely ignoring Alara's calls, manually cross-referencing every single one of Alara's projections against his own internal Texas market data. He was back in his element, the professional consultant, but he was pointing his weapon at his co-conspirator. The betrayal was turning inward. He was consumed by the need to find her mistake and use it against her, saving his own skin by proving her incompetence. I had successfully isolated him and redirected his considerable energy into attacking his own defense. The most effective revenge is the one the antagonist executes on himself. With Robert isolated and paranoid, it was time to bait the final trap. He was terrified of the auditors, terrified of Thomas, and now increasingly suspicious of Alara. He believed his only way out was to liquidate the most crucial joint asset and disappear before the firm imploded. That asset was our primary trust fund, containing the last of the truly liquid, unsecured capital money meant for our retirement, but still legally accessible by him under certain conditions. He had been planning to drain it and wire the funds to an untraceable holding company a week from now. I couldn't wait that long. I needed to force his hand. I created a fake, sophisticated-looking document, a formal letter from the firm's legal counsel stating that due to the complexity of the ongoing IP investigation and the freezing of internal funds, all principal owners were mandated to transfer their personal liquid investment portfolios to a third-party secure escrow account by the end of the next business day. The letter cited obscure corporate law, used impeccable legal jargon, and, most importantly, contained a subtle, easily missable error in the bank's routing number, an error I had deliberately planted. I printed the letter on high-quality stationery, retrieved from a locked office supply cabinet in our home and left it, half-tucked, on Robert's desk, perfectly positioned so it looked like he had left it there himself after receiving it late the previous night. Robert found the letter the next morning. I watched him on the surveillance feed. He read it once, twice, his face paling with every word. The threat was immediate, legitimate-sounding, and catastrophic. Lose his final cash reserve to a corporate freeze, or move it now. He wouldn't risk losing it to the company. He would risk losing it to an immediate transfer. He didn't call the firm's legal counsel to verify. He couldn't risk exposing his own planned fraud to them. He acted on panic. He immediately began setting up the wire transfer. He was using the complex multi-step international wire system he had set up previously for his escape route. He entered the destination details, copying the deliberately flawed routing number from the fake letter I had placed on his desk. The system would initially approve the transfer, but the flaw would cause it to be silently rejected and held in processing limbo by the intermediary bank, unable to reach the destination. The crucial detail, because the transfer was initiated by Robert from a joint account, all subsequent actions including the inevitable rejection would trigger an immediate notification on my phone, which was linked as the secondary account holder. He was transferring his final escape fund directly into my line of sight. The phone in my pocket vibrated. The text alert was short, stark, and utterly final. Wire transfer pending. $XXXXXXX. XX to offshore account. Robert sat back in his chair, visibly relieved, believing he had outmaneuvered the system. He took a long, deep breath. He had secured his future, saved his fortune, and now could watch the rest of his life burn. He didn't know the transfer was already dead in the water, trapped by my planted mistake. He believed the money was safely gone. This false sense of security was my most important weapon for the final hours. I walked into the office, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. I handed him one. "You look like you need that, darling. I heard the phone earlier, more trouble with the audit." He smiled a genuine, though tired, smile of triumph. "Just securing the perimeter, my love. Protecting our future. It's all settled now." I smiled back, sipping my tea. "Good," I murmured. "I hate when things are unsettled." I had the confirmation. He had emptied the account. The money was now legally in motion, trapped in the digital sphere, waiting for my signal. I had successfully isolated him, terrified him, and forced him to move his assets in a way that placed them squarely under my control. The board was set. The final piece was ready to move. The time had come to execute the major twist, the ultimate confrontation not with Robert, but with the puppet master, Mr. Davies. The secondary betrayal was about to come full circle. The end was near. Robert was calm now. His heart rate was down, his paranoia temporarily subdued. He believed the major transfer was complete, the money safely on its way to his private, secure corner of the world. He was relaxed enough to be careless, which was exactly what I needed. His false sense of security was my window to execute the final layer of my intelligence operation. I excused myself, claiming a need for air. I walked into the garden, my secure phone in hand. I looked at the notification. The wire transfer was still pending, caught in the intermediary bank system due to the intentional routing error. It was immobilized, but the money hadn't returned to the account. It was mine to command now. But I still needed the final piece of the conspiracy to ensure his downfall was irreversible and criminal. I had meticulously cross-referenced the Aspen deed with Mr. Davies's corporate structure, but something felt missing. Why would Ilara, a brilliant strategist, risk the entire scheme for a single property linked to her father's primary holding firm? It was too sloppy for her. It felt less like a theft and more like a setup. I returned to the Q4 future files, specifically the encrypted communications between Robert and Ilara. I used a brute force decryption technique on a secondary, deep layer of their messaging, a layer they only used for intensely personal, highly sensitive information. The decrypted messages were not about love or money. They were about hate. "This is the only way, Robert. He won't see me fail, but he will see his golden boy collapse, taking his precious firm and his reputation with him. The Aspen property is the final knot. It links the stolen equity directly to his Miami holding firm. He can't untangle it without admitting he funded my venture. But Ilara, the risk to the entire venture. Risk is the point, Robert. You destroy what he built. You humiliate him. That's the price of my compliance. He deserves to watch his favorites burn. The revelation hit me with the force of an actual blow. Elara Vance was not just a co-conspirator. She was a deeply vengeful daughter. She was Mr. Davies's estranged heir. Her goal was not to build a successful firm. It was to use Robert and his firm as a precision-guided missile to inflict maximum reputational and financial damage on her own father. Robert wasn't her partner. He was her sacrificial lamb. Her deep-seated resentment was the true engine of the entire conspiracy. The affair, the corporate theft, the fraud, it was all a meticulously crafted family tragedy, and Robert and I were just supporting actors in her elaborate, toxic drama of filial revenge. This changed everything. My target was no longer Robert. It was the mechanism of her revenge, the link between the stolen Aspen equity and Mr. Davies's reputation. Robert was still sitting in his office, basking in the illusion of his successful escape. I, however, was in a high-stakes race against time. The investigation into the Athel IP leak and the THM allocation was moving slowly, thanks to my interference. But Mr. Davies, the primary investor, was scheduled for his final financial review of Robert's firm next week. If he signed off on the current audit reports, the entire scheme, Elara's revenge and Robert's escape, would be executed before my evidence could land. I had to bypass Robert entirely and go straight to the power source. I had to alert Mr. Davies, but I couldn't simply send him a document from the wife. It would be discarded as emotional noise. I had to speak his language: risk, solvency, and reputation. I spent the next 2 hours creating the ultimate package. It was not a divorce file. It was a forensic risk assessment report. The report was divided into 3 sections. Section I, the threat to solvency, detailed, side-by-side ledgers proving the THM allocation fraud and the planned asset diversion. Section 2, the reputation exposure, proof of the systematic corporate espionage against Athel Industries and the plan to scapegoat the junior analyst, Michael Harrison, including the exact documents I had previously sent to Michael. Section 3, the familial contamination, the most crucial part, a complete, unredacted set of the Aspen property deed and the decrypted messages detailing Elara's motive and her use of Robert as a tool for revenge against him. I didn't include the messages detailing Robert's affair. That was irrelevant emotion. I only included the lines proving Elara's deep, professional intent to ruin his favorite investment and expose his family drama publicly through the ensuing collapse. This was the threat that would mobilize Mr. Davies instantly. I printed the entire package, over 200 pages of pristine, verifiable financial and legal documentation. I placed it inside a specialized, discreet, unmarked brown box and sealed it with a wax stamp that bore no logo, only an imprint of the scales of justice. I didn't address it to Mr. Davies personally. I addressed it to the head of compliance, Miami Holding Group, attention, urgent legal review. This ensured it would go straight to his internal legal team, bypassing any executive assistant who might filter personal mail. I was treating the betrayal not as a personal crisis, but as a hostile corporate intervention. The next move was out of my hands, but the trajectory was set. Robert and Elara's fate was now entirely dependent on an angry father's reaction to his daughter's professional and familial vengeance. The drive to the private courier service was the last act of Phase 2. I dropped the box at the main depot, paid the exorbitant fee for guaranteed next morning delivery, and watched it disappear onto the conveyor belt. The tension I had carried for weeks began to ease, replaced by a cold, quiet sense of empowerment. I had executed my plan perfectly, using silence, logic, and Robert's own arrogance as my ammunition. I returned home just after nightfall. Robert was still in his office, watching a movie now, the picture of a man relaxing after a successful, dangerous mission. He believed the money was safely gone, that the storm had passed. I went into the kitchen and made myself a cup of herbal tea. I walked back toward the office door. I paused, leaning against the frame. "Robert, do you want me to order takeout? You haven't eaten properly all day." He looked up, surprised by my presence. No, I'm fine, love. Just a little paperwork." I nodded, my gaze dropping to his hands. He was fidgeting, absent-mindedly clicking a cheap plastic pen. His Mont Blanc was still missing. He was still worried about the ghost, but he was completely oblivious to the far greater threat I had just unleashed halfway across the country. I walked away without another word, I had nothing left to say to him. The game had gone global. While Robert worried about a missing pen and an audit in Dallas, Mr. Davies's compliance team in Miami was about to open a box that detailed the financial and professional destruction of his company and the betrayal by his own blood. The final, climactic shift was a matter of timing. The package would arrive at 8 a.m. EST. Robert's world would detonate shortly thereafter. I was merely waiting for the sound of the explosion. The package was airborne, heading for Miami. Robert was asleep upstairs, blissfully unaware that his entire financial and professional world was on a trajectory to self-destruct. The waiting was the hardest part, the silence before the thunder. It wasn't passive, it was the intense, coiled tension of a predator watching its trap spring shut. I was no longer angry. I was empowered. I had executed the intelligence phase, maneuvered the antagonists, and secured my assets. Now, I merely needed to perform the final, required actions to secure the money I had immobilized. The wire transfer Robert initiated was still hanging in limbo, held by the intermediary bank due to the flawed routing number I had engineered. The money was neither here nor there, but the intent to transfer it was complete, and the funds had been debited from the joint account. My move was simple, legal, and decisive. I contacted the intermediary bank, not as Clara Harris, the wife, but as Clara Harris, the secondary authorized joint account holder. I presented the bank with a carefully worded, notarized document prepared by my own secure legal team weeks ago asserting that the account had been compromised and that the recent transfer attempt, initiated by the primary holder, Robert, contained suspicious, non-standard routing errors and was inconsistent with the account's historical activity. I requested a mandatory and immediate reversal of the transaction, moving the funds not back into the compromised joint account but into the pre-established, fully secure, legally compliant Cayman's holding structure. The bank, fearful of liability, and seeing the clear documentation of the flawed routing and the notification from a legal account holder, complied without question. Within the hour, the multi-million-dollar asset Robert thought he had secured for his escape was legally, irrevocably, and silently swept into the offshore trust fund, now solely under my control. Robert's escape fund was gone. He had risked everything to move the money, and that movement had delivered it directly to me. The irony was intoxicating. I walked back into the living room, the quietest multi-million-dollar transaction in Texas history having just been executed. I looked at the house, the monument to the lie. It was mine, legally protected against future claim. The money was safe. Robert had nothing left but the clothes on his back, the dwindling equity in the car, and a handful of hidden business accounts that the auditors were already circling. The ghost was no longer just an observer. The ghost was now the executor of the will of his financial ruin. The financial victory was complete, and he was still sleeping upstairs dreaming of his freedom. The next morning, the package arrived in Miami. I tracked the courier notification to its final delivery at 8:03 a.m. EST. I knew exactly when the head of compliance would receive it, when the contents would be processed, and when the cold, focused fury of Mr. Davies would be unleashed. Robert woke up around 9 a.m. still groggy, still confident. He went straight to his office to check his secured offshore account, expecting to see the transferred funds safely arrived. I watched the surveillance feed, anticipating the moment of realization. He logged in. The balance was 0. He didn't scream. He didn't smash the computer. He simply froze. A statue carved out of disbelief. He reloaded the page, checked the transfer confirmation. It showed completed, but the funds were not in the destination account. He frantically called the intermediary bank. The conversation, heard faintly through the door, was a masterpiece of desperation and denial. The bank informed him coolly and officially that the funds had been transferred out of the joint account and reversed into a secure, authorized holding structure following a request from an authorized account holder citing security compromise. Robert went white. He knew only one person could have done this. Only one person had the legal authority, the knowledge of the structure, and the absolute lack of self-preservation required to pull off such a move. He looked around his office, his eyes finally landing on the empty space where his Montblanc pen used to sit. The missing pen, the signal, the quiet mockery was no longer a worry. It was the final, devastating confirmation. The ghost was me. Before Robert could fully absorb his financial destruction, the real external storm hit. His secure phone, the line he used only for Alara, rang shrilly, The volume was loud enough for me to hear the hysterical, furious panic on the other end. "Robert! My father just called. They have everything. The Aspen deed, the Q4 projections, the THM transfers. He pulled the entire investment line. The firm is locked down. He's calling the police." "What did you do? Who did you tell?" "I told you I would cut you loose. This is your fault." The call ended with a violent disconnect. The domino effect was immediate. Mr. Davies, enraged by the familial contamination and the blatant fraud, hadn't issued a warning, he had issued an execution order. He used his immense legal and financial power to freeze the assets of the entire new venture, effectively killing Elara's company and trapping Robert in the wreckage. Robert dropped the phone. He was shattered, caught between financial devastation and the absolute collapse of his professional conspiracy. He had lost the money, lost his partner, and lost his future, all within the span of 30 minutes. He staggered out of the office, his eyes locking on me. I was standing in the hallway, holding a sealed envelope. I didn't speak. I simply walked over to him and placed the envelope gently into his trembling hand. He opened it. It was a printed bank statement, showing the funds from the failed wire transfer successfully credited to a newly named account, C. Harris Irrevocable Trust. Beneath the statement was a single clean sheet of paper, a signed, non-contested marital settlement agreement and divorce petition, legally finalized, dated weeks ago. It was ready to be filed with the court, requiring only his signature on the final page, acknowledging receipt. He looked from the statement, the proof that I had taken everything, to the divorce papers, the proof that I had been planning his exit for weeks. His face contorted, but no words came out. He raised his hand, not to strike me, but to simply push the papers away, shaking his head slowly. The silence of his defeat was deafening. He was defeated not by a screaming wife, but by a methodical, cold machine he had never bothered to notice. I had provided the execution, and now I was providing the quiet exit. The power was entirely mine. Robert didn't sign the divorce papers immediately. He didn't need to. He stood there, holding the proof of my financial execution, the bank statement and the pre-signed legal documents. His world had collapsed, not in a firestorm, but in a series of silent, surgical strikes. He stumbled away, retreating to the one place he still felt ownership over, his office. But even that space was now tainted by the memory of the missing pen and the surveillance he never detected. His first rational act was to attempt contact with the only person he believed could still save him, Elara Vance. He needed her cold, strategic mind, her financial resources, and her connection to her father, Mr. Davies, who was now the source of the catastrophe. He called her private line. She answered, but not with panic. Her tone was measured, sharp, and final. "Robert, don't call this line again. My father has instructed his compliance team to flag all communications from you. You are compromised. Everything is frozen. I am completely disentangling myself. You were supposed to be clean leverage. Instead, you're a liability. Your entire firm is under injunction, effective immediately. Get a lawyer, Robert. And lose this number." She hung up. The rejection was brutal, absolute, and purely professional. She hadn't hesitated for a moment to jettison him. He was no longer her golden boy of corporate destruction. He was simply collateral damage. The isolation was complete. The immediate domino effect began minutes later. The firm's main server, where Robert's firm operated, went offline. An injunction, an official order issued by Mr. Davies's high-powered legal team, had frozen all assets, communications and client accounts. The Athel IP investigation, which had been a low simmer, instantly became a full-blown fraud investigation, with Robert as the primary target. I watched him receive the barrage of texts and emails from panicked partners, from his own legal counsel, demanding immediate answers he couldn't provide. He was no longer in charge of the narrative. The law was now. Just as Robert was contemplating his next move, perhaps attempting to wipe his hard drives, there was a sharp, official knock on our front door. I was standing in the kitchen. I didn't move. I knew who it was. The knock was too authoritative, too measured to be a delivery or a friend. Robert, shaking, walked to the door and opened it. Standing there were two men in dark suits, holding clipboards and official badges. They were forensic investigators, accompanied by a process server delivering the court order. I heard the cold, non-negotiable legal jargon. "Mr. Robert Harris, We are here to serve you with this restraining order and search warrant, issued on behalf of Davies Holding Group and Harris Consulting Partners. You are instructed to immediately cease and desist all operations, surrender all digital devices, and refrain from leaving the jurisdiction. The shock of the physical presence of the law, the ultimate authority, finally shattered the last vestiges of his arrogance. He was powerless. I had summoned the consequence, and it had arrived on our doorstep. The next few hours were a dizzying scene of legal execution. Robert was confined to the living room while the forensic team methodically, professionally, dismantled his digital life. They seized his computers, his work phones, and even his personal tablet. The elegance and precision of the investigation were satisfying. They weren't looking for a secret love nest. They were looking for financial fraud, IP theft, and evidence linking him to the Delaware LLC, the exact documents I had photographed and provided to Mr. Davies. I was treated with cool, professional deference. When the lead investigator asked me about my knowledge of Robert's business practices, I gave a perfectly measured response, layered in plausible denial and wifely ignorance. I handle the home and our personal investments. Robert handled the business. He always said everything was secure and above board. I trusted him. I assumed he was honest. My answers placed me perfectly, the betrayed wife, shielded by her own domestic ignorance, yet possessing the crucial knowledge of the security compromise I had used to recover our joint funds. The fact that the transfer had been reversed by an authorized party protected me from any suspicion of aiding Robert's fraud. I was the victim who had saved her own assets just in time. As the investigators worked, Robert sat watching, his facade completely gone. He was seeing his professional identity, his entire carefully constructed life pulled apart piece by piece. He looked utterly defeated, the realization dawning that every single avenue of escape had been anticipated and sealed off. The scene was interrupted by another knock. This time it was Thomas. He had been locked out of his own office and was demanding answers. When he saw the forensic investigators and Robert's defeat, his face went from rage to a chilling, dawning comprehension. He walked past the investigators, straight up to Robert, who looked away, unable to meet his eyes. "Tachem. That's what they're looking for, isn't it? The allocation that would have bankrupted us all. And Michael? You framed an innocent kid, Robert. 15 years. 15 years of friendship and partnership, and you were setting us all up for financial destruction." Robert muttered something about circumstances and external pressure. Thomas didn't listen. He looked at the chaos, then back at me. He saw the cold calm in my posture, the sealed envelope on the counter, and the look of utter ruin on Robert's face. In that moment, Thomas didn't see an innocent wife. He saw the quiet, powerful force that had orchestrated his salvation and Robert's fall. The look he gave me wasn't accusatory. It was a profound, questioning recognition. The first flicker of a potential new ally. Thomas was pulled aside by the investigators, who needed his statement. I watched them go. The house was finally quiet again, filled only with the mechanical clicking of the forensic equipment. Robert looked up at me, his eyes empty. He finally spoke, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. "The dinner. That night. You were there. You were 3 tables away. You saw the text, didn't you?" It wasn't a question. It was a realization, the culmination of all his denial. He had finally connected the initial, casual lie to his entire, devastating collapse. I walked over to the desk, picked up the final, unsigned page of the divorce petition, and placed it on the coffee table beside him. "I saw everything, Robert. From the beginning. And then I went to work." I turned and walked away, leaving him alone in the room with his ruined reputation, his seized assets, and the paperwork confirming his quiet final separation from the life he had used me to build. I went to my private closet. I opened a small, locked metal box. Inside lay the Montblanc pen. I held it for a moment, the symbol of my access and his ultimate blindness. I didn't keep it. I placed it in a simple unsealed envelope and left it on the kitchen counter, addressed only to R.H. When the investigators inevitably allowed Robert to gather a few personal belongings, he would find it. The return of the stolen object was the final, elegant statement of my total control. His punishment was not simply losing his money, but knowing that the moment of his greatest betrayal was the moment his execution began. The final curtain was about to drop. The house was eerie after the forensic team departed. They took all the noise, the urgency, and the digital evidence, leaving Robert with nothing but the physical space and his crushing realization. He sat alone in the living room, surrounded by the remnants of his life, an empty glass, scattered papers, and the profound, echoing silence of his failure. He finally noticed the small envelope on the kitchen counter. R.H. He walked slowly toward it, his movements sluggish, weighted by defeat. He opened the envelope and found the Mont Blanc pen, his prized possession, the object that had been the silent harbinger of my operation. Holding the pen, he finally grasped the full, cold extent of my silent power. The pen wasn't just proof of my access to his secrets. It was a signature of my presence at every critical juncture of his betrayal. I hadn't needed to shout. I had simply left my mark on his consciousness. He looked at the pen, then back to the unsigned divorce papers. He had to face me now. The legal battle was lost. The financial battle was lost. All that remained was the personal confrontation, the need to understand how the seemingly oblivious wife had transformed into his quiet executioner. He found me in the master bedroom, calmly packing a small suitcase with clothes and essentials. I wasn't leaving forever, but I was leaving the house to him, the wreckage of his life. For the next 24 hours, the separation was physical and definitive. He stood in the doorway, blocking my exit, his body rigid with a contained, desperate energy. The key. The bank. The money. You transferred the funds. You've been planning this for how long? From that night? I looked up, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since the package landed in Miami. My voice was even, devoid of the emotion he craved. I started planning the moment your text arrived. Stuck at mom's for dinner, love you. While you were 3 tables away, planning my financial destruction with Alara. I didn't plan for revenge, Robert. I planned for solvency. I planned for my future without the contamination of your greed. He stepped closer, a flicker of the old, charismatic anger returning. You ruined me. I could have saved the firm. I could have saved my career. I had an escape plan. You had a fraudulent tax shelter scheme and a plan to ruin Michael Harrison, an innocent junior analyst, and then set up Thomas, your oldest partner, to take the fall for the THM allocation. You didn't just cheat on me, Robert. You poisoned every relationship you had. For the sake of Alara's family vendetta. You didn't lose your career because of me. You lost it because you built it on rot. I paused, letting the truth sink in. I simply made sure the consequence arrived before you could hurt anyone else. The confrontation wasn't a fight. It was an inquest. Robert realized I knew every detail, every lie, every hidden transaction. He was stripped bare. He tried one last, desperate appeal to the life we shared. But everything we built, the house, the life. I needed you for that. You were my anchor, Clara. I never wanted to lose you. Alara was just a means to an end, business. The lie was flimsy, pathetic. An anchor doesn't wait for the ship to sink. An anchor provides stability. When I realized you were drilling holes in the hull and trying to steal the lifeboat, I simply cut the line and took my own vessel to safe harbor. The house is part of the liquidated assets. The equity you stole has been secured. Your means to an end has led to your end. He dropped the Mont Blanc pen onto the wooden floor. The sharp clack was the sound of his last shred of dignity shattering. He then tried to shift the blame, focusing on the financial maneuver that had ruined him. The transfer. The security compromise. You used my own mistake against me. That was illegal. I smiled, a thin, cold expression of absolute certainty. It was not illegal, Robert. The funds were joint marital assets. I, as an authorized account holder, executed a request to safeguard them from what appeared to be a fraudulent transfer with routing errors. The bank verified and complied. The law is meticulous, Robert. You only broke the law. I simply followed it perfectly. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the Mont Blanc pen I had retrieved from the kitchen. I held it out to him, not as a gift, but as the final piece of evidence. When you texted me stuck at mom's for dinner, love you. You proved that your biggest lie wasn't the affair. Your biggest lie was thinking I was stupid. Thinking I was ornamental. That text was not just a lie to me. It was an act of profound, arrogant condescension. I didn't want your emotional ruin, Robert. I wanted your respect, and since you wouldn't give it to me, I had to take it, along with everything else. He took the pen, his hands shaking. He understood. My vengeance was not about emotion. It was about agency. It was about proving that the woman he dismissed was the only one capable of dismantling his empire. The confrontation was over. There was nothing left to say. He knew the truth, and the truth had stripped him bare. I picked up my small, packed suitcase. As I turned to leave the room, Robert spoke one last, desperate sentence. "Where are you going, Clara?" I paused at the door, but I didn't turn back. "I'm going to finish the divorce, Robert. And then, I'm going to start my life." I left the house, leaving him standing in the middle of the room, holding the pen, the symbol of his quiet, absolute defeat. The irony was the final, elegant stroke of my victory. He had to sign the divorce papers, acknowledging the end of our marriage, using the very pen that I had stolen, used to mock him, and returned as the ultimate symbol of his demise. I drove away, not looking back at the beautiful house. The GPS tracker, still quietly functional on his car in the garage, showed that Robert hadn't moved. He was trapped, immobilized by the consequences of his own calculated choices. The house was empty now, filled only with the ghost of his betrayal and the echoes of my quiet departure. The antagonist's breakdown was complete. Now, it was time for the final decisive action, turning the ruins of the past into the foundation of my future. The final pieces of the puzzle, the redemption of Michael and Thomas and the formal legal closure, were all that remained. I left the mansion that night and checked into a quiet, understated boutique hotel in a different part of the city. I needed silence, not celebration. I needed a clean space to transition from the strategist to the architect of my new life. The next morning, the domino effect continued, this time moving into the formal legal domain. My attorney filed the divorce petition and the final marital settlement agreement, with the proof of Robert's asset liquidation attached. The papers were delivered to Robert, who, according to the GPS tracker, was still at the house, drinking and staring at the walls. He had to sign, or face a contested divorce that would force him to reveal his fraudulent activities to the court, something he absolutely could not risk. I knew he would sign. The alternative was self-incrimination. My final act of revenge was not the theft of his money, but the compulsion of his truth. He was forced to legally affirm my version of the financial reality that he had no claim to the Cayman's trust and that the house was the primary remaining asset which would be sold to cover his escalating legal fees. He used the Mont Blanc, I was sure of it, to sign his own quiet ruin. While Robert faced his legal reckoning, I turned my attention to the first act of redemption, Michael Harrison, the young analyst they had so ruthlessly scapegoated. I had sent him the proof, but I needed to ensure that proof had worked. I placed a single, anonymous call to Michael's private mobile number. "Mr. Harrison, I'm calling about your recent dismissal from Harris Consulting. Are you currently represented by legal counsel?" Michael's voice was hesitant but firm. "Yes, I am. The evidence I was provided, the internal discrepancy report showed the IP leak was orchestrated by senior management, not me. My lawyer is filing a wrongful termination suit this afternoon. They were forced to back down from the slander." The relief was immense. My intervention had saved his reputation, if not his job. The truth was now embedded in the legal system, forcing Robert and Alara to deal with a new, external threat I had manufactured. My plan had succeeded, but I still had one loose end, Thomas. The former business partner had seen the operation firsthand, but he only had fragments of the truth. He still didn't know who had saved him from the THM allocation. That afternoon, my phone rang. The number was blocked. "Clara? This is Thomas. I had to call. The paperwork the auditors found, the details about the THM transfers. They were so precise. And the way Robert folded. It was like someone knew every move he was going to make before he made it." I allowed a calculated moment of silence. "Thomas, I am divorcing Robert. I can't discuss his business. But I can tell you this, Robert and Alara were running a game. And in a game of high stakes there's always an unknown player. Sometimes that player decides to save the good ones. The good ones. You knew the allocation, you knew about Michael. You were always meticulous, Clara. You were always the smartest person in that firm. Thank you. For the warning, and for everything else. I owe you a debt I can't repay." I used his gratitude not for personal gain, but for the final, unexpected act of closure. Thomas's acknowledgement of my silent power was the confirmation I needed. He was not just saved, he was now indebted. This led directly to the final twist, the quietest, most ironic move of the entire operation. Robert's primary concern, now that his liquid assets were gone, was his escalating legal debt. The only asset he had left was the house. He needed it sold fast. Thomas, on the other hand, was now the sole surviving, untainted partner of the old firm, looking to rebuild his life and his business, and he needed a new headquarters. I made an anonymous introduction between Thomas and the executor handling the sale of our house. Thomas bought the house quickly, quietly, and for a fair price. The final irony was complete. Robert's former marital home, the beautiful prison built on the lie, was now bought by the man he had tried to betray. The money from the sale would go entirely to Robert's mounting legal fees, indirectly funding the defense against the very legal trouble I had instigated. But the true twist, the one I had meticulously planned, lay in the deed. I had insisted, years ago, on a peculiar legal clause in the original deed, a right of first refusal for me, Clara Harris, should the property ever be sold in a distressed state. It was a clause Robert had signed off on, calling it a silly wifely comfort. I didn't invoke the right to buy the house. I simply signed it over to Thomas for the sale, but I added a single, non-financial, non-binding amendment to the transfer documentation. Purchaser agrees to honor the historical significance of the space, including the permanent display of the original Montblanc pen used to sign the final divorce papers. It was a symbolic flourish, but Thomas, knowing the history, agreed immediately. He understood. The Montblanc, the ultimate symbol of Robert's blindness and his quiet defeat, would now sit, framed, in the main office of the firm he tried to destroy, a permanent, physical monument to the ghost who had executed his downfall. Robert would never know the pen's final resting place, but the consequence of his betrayal would be immortalized, staring down at his former partner every day. I had turned my heartbreak into a corporate legend. Days later, the paperwork was complete. The divorce was finalized, quietly and efficiently. Robert was formally served with the documents settling the sale of the house, along with a final, clean check for the negligible balance left after paying the lawyers. I received a simple final text message from my attorney: all clear, financial and legal separation complete, your future is secured. I was sitting in my new, small apartment, the contrast to the mansion's stark but liberating. I looked at my phone, reading the text. There was no elation, only a deep, abiding stillness. I had executed a cold, calculated revenge, not for the satisfaction of his pain, but for the quiet, total reclamation of my own life. I had walked through the fire of betrayal and emerged not as a burned victim, but as the master of my own fate. The final, a most profound irony was that Robert's lie, the text about the dinner, had not ended my life. It had simply launched my true one. The ghost was gone. Only Clara remained. The finality of the divorce was less a closing chapter and more the clean, smooth surface of a new table on which to build. Robert was gone, legally, financially, and physically. He had retreated to a furnished corporate apartment, funded by the last dregs of his liquidated assets, facing mounting criminal investigations stemming from Mr. Davies's relentless legal pursuit. Ilara was consumed by the same legal fire, her relationship with her father publicly shattered, her career ruined. My life, however, was quiet and profitable. My first act was not one of luxury but of consolidation. I formally transferred the entirety of the secured trust fund from the Cayman structure into a series of transparent, domestic investment portfolios. I didn't want the complexity or the secrecy anymore. I wanted the bedrock of clarity. The assets were now clean, organized, and entirely my own, a formidable fortune built on the foundation Robert had tried to undermine. I didn't immediately launch a new business. I spent weeks simply reading, observing, and reflecting on the power I had cultivated. I realized my true asset was not the money. It was the strategic mindset Robert's betrayal had forced me to adopt. I had spent years using my organizational skills to manage his chaotic ambition. Now, I could apply that meticulous focus to my own destiny. I took time to compensate those damaged by Robert's recklessness. I quietly established an anonymous fund for Michael Harrison, the junior analyst, not only covering his legal fees for the wrongful termination suit but providing him with a substantial financial cushion to restart his career, free of the shadow Robert had cast. It was a gesture of justice, a cleaning of the moral slate. The phone call came 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized. It was Thomas, Clara, I know you don't want anything to do with the old firm and I respect that, but I'm officially relaunching under a new name, Integrity Consulting. And I need a COO. Someone with unparalleled precision, someone I can trust absolutely. Someone who understands risk, solvency, and corporate vulnerability better than anyone I know. I need the silent shadow. I need you. The offer was unexpected. Thomas, indebted to me, was not offering charity. He was offering a partnership built on genuine respect and mutual understanding of Robert's failure. He saw the strategist, the operator, not the victim. The idea of returning to the consulting world, but as the power, the architect, and not the supportive wife, was tempting. It would be my greatest act of reclaiming power, turning the battlefield into my throne room. I didn't accept Thomas's offer immediately. I negotiated. I set terms, full operational control, complete financial transparency, and a mandate that Integrity Consulting would be built on the very principles Robert had violated. It wasn't just a job. It was a mission statement, a moral opposition to the greed I had fought. Thomas agreed to every term. The first time I stepped into the new office space, Robert's old house, it was a surreal experience. Thomas had completely renovated the interior, stripping away the ornate, arrogant decor Robert had favored, replacing it with clean, modern lines and an atmosphere of professional calm. The space was transformed. I walked into what had been Robert's private office, now Thomas's headquarters, and there it was, framed discreetly on the wall, mounted on velvet, the Mont Blanc pen. It wasn't a warning to Thomas, it was a reminder of the price of deceit. It was Thomas's way of honoring the ghost. I smiled, a genuine, reflective smile. The house was no longer a cage, it was the headquarters of my empowerment. I chose my own office, the sun-drenched, meticulously organized former guest suite. It was quiet, functional, and separate from the main administrative chaos. It was the perfect sanctuary for the chief strategist. My work was meticulous, focusing on structural integrity and preemptive risk assessment, exactly what I had done to survive Robert. I excelled. I didn't need to dominate the boardroom. I dominated the details. I was the silent foundation that ensured the entire structure could withstand any storm. One evening, months into my new role, I was working late. My phone buzzed. It was a simple, untraceable text message, sent to an old, personal number I hadn't changed. The company looks strong. Be careful. They always come back. It wasn't signed. The message was vague, unnerving. Was it Robert trying to inject fear? Or Alara, issuing a threat? I didn't panic. I analyzed it. The tone was not desperate but cautious. I performed a quick, discreet trace on the source IP. It was a common public library connection, quickly masked. But the time zone and the style of the text felt familiar. It felt like Thomas, perhaps testing my security, perhaps genuinely worried, maintaining the audit watch persona he knew I had created. Or perhaps it was Michael, having learned the lesson of caution. The point wasn't the sender. It was the reminder. The ghost, though now empowered, could never forget the lesson of vigilance. My composure remained absolute. I simply secured my current work and shut down the laptop. I was ready for any return engagement. I didn't reply to the anonymous text. I didn't need to. I had moved beyond reacting to shadows. My reflection was complete. I realized that Robert's biggest mistake was assuming my contribution, the management of the home, the finances, the social calendar, was merely a service. He never realized that the meticulous discipline required to maintain that perfect life was the same discipline required to dismantle his deception. I had reclaimed my agency through intelligence, not hysteria. I hadn't succumbed to the messy drama Robert expected. I used irony and silence as my weapons, forcing him to witness his own ruin, executed by the one person he deemed least capable. I looked out the window of my new office, the skyline of Dallas sharp and clean. I was safe, secure, and profoundly powerful. I had built a new life that needed no mask, no pretense. I opened a new, blank document on my screen. The title was simple: Integrity Consulting, 5-Year Strategy and Global Expansion. I was no longer planning to survive. I was planning to thrive. I was planning to build an empire of honesty on the grave of a lie. The reflection was done. The quiet victory was within reach. I just had to write the final chapter myself. The final stage of any great deception is not the explosion but the profound, echoing silence that follows. Robert's life continued its downward spiral, documented only by dry legal filings and occasional news articles about the fraud investigation. Alara's attempt at family vengeance had failed spectacularly, leaving her financially ruined and professionally blacklisted. They were consuming each other in a spiral of legal and personal recriminations. I, meanwhile, was experiencing the quietest, most dignified victory possible. The core of my triumph was not the money, though the financial security was essential, but the absolute reclamation of my identity. I was no longer defined by Robert's ambition or his betrayal. I was defined by my own competence and the cold courage I had found in the face of absolute betrayal. My role at Integrity Consulting was formalized as Chief Strategy Officer. I rarely interacted with clients, preferring to work in the background, analyzing risks and designing long-term structures. I was the silent foundation, the iron core that ensured Thomas's firm would never repeat the mistakes of the past. The irony of working in Robert's former house was a quiet, daily pleasure. It was a constant reminder that the greatest architects of destruction often become the accidental architects of renewal. I often thought back to the night in the Onyx Room. I realized that my most powerful weapon was the knowledge that Robert needed the lie more than he needed the truth. He needed the comforting delusion of the oblivious, supportive wife so he could sustain his own image of himself as the competent, charming mastermind. When I chose silence over confrontation, I didn't save my marriage. I preserved his delusion just long enough to gather the evidence and build the perfect trap. The silence was not fear. It was strategic patience. One rare morning, a letter arrived at the office, addressed to me personally. The handwriting was familiar, looping, and arrogant. It was from Robert. It had been sent from a new address, a generic post office box far out of the city. My heart didn't race. My hand didn't shake. I simply weighed the letter, recognizing the need for one final, strategic engagement. I opened it. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an apology. It was a single, cryptic sentence. Tell me, Clara. Was it worth the cost? Did you win? I read the words 3 times. He was still assessing the situation through a competitive, financial lens. He still saw our life as a zero-sum game. I didn't reply directly. I simply walked into Thomas's office, where Thomas was proudly showing off the newly framed Montblanc pen to a visiting client. The pen gleamed under the track lighting, a polished monument to my victory. I smiled, letting the pen be my answer. My answer was in the quiet, absolute confidence of my life. It was in the integrity of the firm I was helping to build. It was in the fact that Michael Harrison was now working for a prestigious competitor, fully redeemed. It was in the fact that Thomas was thriving, now free from Robert's toxic ambition. The cost Robert asked about was the cost of shedding the lie. And the answer was immeasurable gain. I had gained self-possession, financial freedom, and a fierce, unshakable trust in my own judgment. I formalized my moral statement. I used a portion of the interest from my trust fund to quietly establish the Onyx Room Foundation, a fund dedicated to providing legal and financial assistance to partners and employees who become victims of corporate and marital fraud. It was a subtle, final nod to the restaurant where the betrayal began. The place of my greatest pain became the source of quiet justice for others. This was the final piece of the resolution. My victory was not just personal, it was systemic. I had turned the engine of my heartbreak into an engine of change. I sometimes wondered what would have happened if I had simply thrown the Chardonnay that night, if I had screamed, made a scene, and filed for divorce the next day. I would have received a fair settlement, but Robert would have walked away intact, his reputation merely grazed, his arrogance reinforced. He would have found another woman, another venture, and continued his pattern of careless deception. Instead, I chose the long game. I chose the path of the unseen witness, allowing him the illusion of control until the very moment he delivered the final weapon into my hands. I was having dinner alone one evening, at a different, quieter restaurant. I looked up and saw a familiar face, sitting 2 tables away. Alara Vance. She was dining with an elderly woman, dressed in sober, understated clothes. Alara looked tired, aged, and drawn. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a nervous, hunted quality. Our eyes met across the gap. She recognized me instantly. The blood drained from her face. She knew who I was, and she knew exactly why her life was currently in ruins. The ghost was real. I held her gaze for a long moment, A moment that stretched across the months of my planning and her downfall. I didn't frown. I didn't smirk. I offered a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of our shared history and my quiet victory. Then, I returned to my meal, my composure absolute. Alara, visibly shaken, quickly gathered her things and left the restaurant. That encounter was the final closure I needed. She left. Not because I threatened her, but because my presence was a living, breathing consequence she could not escape. I had claimed my power, and she was forced to flee the light of the truth. I finished my dinner, unhurried, peaceful. The moral of the story is simple, etched in the cold calculation of the balance sheet and the warm satisfaction of self-possession. The greatest power is the one others never see coming. The quietest revenge is the most effective. It is the revenge that dismantles the enemy's world using their own tools and their own rules. Robert thought I was a domestic placeholder. I was a strategic contingency plan. I won, Robert. Not because I was cruel, but because I stopped playing the game he designed. I designed my own, and I won the quiet victory. And the best part? I didn't need to scream, or cry, or rage. I just needed to go to work. My story ends here, a quiet victory, a total reclamation. But the threat of betrayal never ends. If you've walked this path with me, witnessing the cold calculation and the silent power, you know the true cost of being unprepared. Don't let your story end with a lie. If you value the power of vigilance, if you respect the long game, then you know what to do. Subscribe now. Be part of the community that chooses strategy over hysteria. And for those of you who still haven't subscribed, who feel resistance to this cold, hard truth, tell me in the comments, right now, why do you think Robert was justified in his actions? Why are you willing to let the silent betrayals go unpunished? Tell me why the quiet victory frightens you.